We will be sending out the video tomorrow. It'll be up on our YouTube channel on the ATU CRU YouTube channel. Thank you all for joining us for this talk on Targeted Agricultural Modernisation Scheme, Tams. Special thanks to Barry Caslin from Teagasc for joining us, the Energy and Rural Development Specialist. We're just going to do a very quick overview of the SEC program. We're running this as part of the Sustainable Energy Communities program. I work in the Border&West as a mentor. So I'm just going to give a little overview of what that is. And I can see some more people are just joining there. So I'll give a quick overview and then I'll hand over to Barry. So what is a sustainable energy community? It is a community that works together to develop a sustainable energy system for the benefit of the community, aiming to be as energy efficient as possible, using renewables energy where feasible, considering smart energy solutions. So this can be as small as a street or as large as a region, and we would have lots of agricultural groups who would have joined as different SECs. So across Ireland, we've got over 900 signed up. In the Border&West, the region that we look after, and I'm joined here by my colleagues, Pather, Eve and Mel, and we might have a few more mentors online as well. So we have 260 currently, and in fact, I think there was one that just signed up about 5 minutes ago, so I suppose that's 261 now. So this is an old map, but it gives an overview of the coverage across the Border&West. In each county, we have at least 2 mentors. So if you're looking to find your local SEC, maybe you can get involved one that's already there. SAI have this map where you can go to your county and figure out what SECs are close to you. Of course, you can sign up if you have another group you'd like to sign up yourself and get support from ourselves. There is a web page on the SAI website to do that. So after this, I'll be sending out an email with a link to the YouTube channel, a link to this map, and a link to how to register as an SEC. So that's me. I'm going to hand it over to Barry now. And again, thanks very much for joining us, Barry. This is a topic that has come up quite a few times with our SECs around TAMS and the renewable energy side of things.
Hi, Paul. Good evening, everyone. And thanks for the invite to be here. Good to see Mel again there. Done a good bit of work with Mel there in the past as well. He's doing fantastic work there in Sligo and the regions there. Yeah, you stop sharing. I was just going to ask you to stop sharing, so I'll share my screen here now. Okay. And you can just confirm that you can see my screen.
That's perfect, yeah.
Okay, very good. Okay, folks, so I'm going to talk to you this evening about energy in agriculture. I know you did mention the word TAMS there, Paul, there in your introduction, but I'll probably talk about other areas of agriculture where farmers have been I suppose, energy in agriculture that affect farmers today. And I'm quite happy to take any questions that you want, and probably it might be easiest at the end, Paul. So yeah, I suppose we have a good idea about where energy is used in the different sectors. And I suppose if you looked at the different agricultural sectors, I suppose dairying, pigs, poultry, they'd be the sectors that use the majority of energy in agricultural systems. Horticulture as well would come in there quite high as well. The mushroom industry, the soft fruit industry, they'd be high users of energy also. So you can just see that with the benchmark figures that we use is the typical figures of, from between 1,550 kilowatt hours per cow in a dairy situation down to the most efficient people that will be down to maybe 1,200 kilowatt hours per cow. There's some that will be higher than the 1550, some lower than the 1210, but they'll be the averages. But you can see there when you have best practice technologies, best practice in terms of efficiency, you can reduce your energy, whether it's in water heating or milk cooling or in field operations. It is possible to improve efficiencies in all those areas, but you can see the majority of the energy is actually in field operations and dairy farms. It's energy used for tractor diesel. So just moving on then to the next sector, which is the pig sector. So again, you can see quite a divergence there as well. 36 kilowatt hours per pig produced for, I suppose, the average, and then for the best practice scenarios will be down to 16 kilowatt hours per pig produced. And that's all between the farrowing unit, the waning unit, the finishing unit. And you can see there's everything to do with ventilation, lighting systems, motive power and pumping, heating, lighting. All those areas are all consume a lot of energy. So there are efficient technologies that can be used to improve the efficiencies there, whether it's efficient fans, ventilation systems, pumping systems, variable speed drives. All of those can contribute towards more efficient systems. And again, within poultry, if you look at broiler systems, it's kilowatt hours per 100 kilograms of meat. That's the metrics that we use there. And best practice scenarios to ordinary scenarios is 29 kilowatt hours per 100 kilograms of meat produced to 61 kilowatt hours per 100 kilograms of meat produced. And again, all the different areas, similar to pigs, actually. Just wanted to make everyone aware as well that the SEAI do have an audit voucher that is available to farmers. So anyone that has an annual spend of over €10,000 per year on their energy, they can avail of this audit of audit voucher for €2,000. It generally covers the cost of the audit. So that's really looking at where energy is being consumed on the farms, whether it's in milk cooling or monitoring systems or pumps or lighting or heat recovery. Very often, many dairy farmers, it's their water system. Quite simply, they have a leak in there and they're pumping water from their own well and it's leaking, and there's lots of losses there along the way. And many are surprised when after an audit and they discover that they had a leak for many years, and that's contributing to the electricity usage on their farm, of course. In the climate action plan, so I know the CAP can mean different things to different people. So the climate action plan is what I'm referring to here. It would CAP can also mean Common Agricultural Policy, but I'm talking here about the climate action plan. And there's a target there in our climate action plan for 2030 of 8 gigawatts of onshore wind by 2030. So the land area that's needed will be determined there by the turbine capacity. Is it a 2 megawatt, a 3 megawatt, a 5 megawatt, a 6 megawatt turbine? The land use efficiency, how easy it is, the contours on the land will determine the amount of land that's going to be needed to build these turbines. But I suppose a 3 megawatt turbine would require in the region of 0.8 hectares or 2 acres of land. And that depends on the space and the setback and access roads. All of that will determine it. If there's forestry beside it, you'd be settled back from a forestry that will be, I suppose, taken from the wind speed potentially in an area. A larger 6 megawatt turbine might require 2 hectares or 5 acres because larger foundation areas will be needed there as well. So if we were to meet the 8 gigawatt target by 2030, and we assumed it's 3 megawatt turbines at 2 acres per turbine, that'll be just 5,334 acres, approximately just over 5,000 acres of land will be needed for those turbines. But not all of that land will be needed, because a lot of that land would be used, could be grazed by cattle or sheep, so it wouldn't all be required. If we move on there to solar energy, so the RES, or the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme, this is the policy instrument there that's driving the adoption of solar PV and wind. So the 2030 Climate Action Plan target is 8 gigawatts of solar PV by 2030. The estimations are we'll possibly have 1.5 gigawatt of that from roof-mounted solar, and 6.5 gigawatts of that will be from ground-mounted solar. So that's large tracts of land covered by solar PV panels. So the 1.5 gigawatt will include microgeneration, mini generation on your own roofs of your domestic houses, where farmers put it up on the roofs of their sheds. That's all part of the 1.5 gigawatt. But it'll be the largest proportion of the solar will be ground mounted, and there'll be lots of land covered by solar panels by 2030. Many farmers have been approached right throughout the country to have the land available to put maybe solar panels on, or maybe put wind turbines on. The size of the solar farm tends to be 250 acres plus, so that they will be looking in the region of around maybe 250 to 300 acres of land in one block. So they try and pair up farmers with one another and maybe to get maybe 3 or 4 or 5 farmers with tracts of land that they will commit towards a solar panel farm. So to meet our target of 6.5 gigawatt by 2030, that would require in the region of around 26,000 acres of land, assuming there are 4 acres of land per megawatt would be needed. And another area where farmers are being approached at the moment is the area of battery energy storage systems. These allow for intermittent technologies to be managed. So wind and solar are what's called intermittent technologies. They don't generate electricity all year round or 24 hours a day. They're only generating electricity when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing. So battery storage allows you to store that energy and dispatch it at a time when it's actually needed on the grid. So they're typically located, these battery energy systems, energy storage systems are located near solar PV arrays or wind turbines. They're an additional source of income for landowners as well, because farmers tend to be offered fairly high rents for land where a battery energy storage system typically might be maybe a 3-4 acre site that would be needed for a battery energy storage system. So it's a fairly small footprint of ground that's needed. I suppose farmers need to understand agreements. Many of them are being approached at the moment by developers who are asking them to sign option agreements, heads of terms, long-term lease agreements. And of course, it's a once-off decision, and farmers, they are asked to enter into what's called an option period. And that gives the developer access to the land to do surveys, to get their planning permission sorted, and to do all the due diligence that's needed in terms of getting the application in for planning and grid connection. An option period is typically for 5 years. Some farmers are paid during that 5-year period, maybe a small sum of money. And once then that the planning permission is sorted, the grid connection is sorted, and is successfully bid into a res auction, the farmer could be told to get their cattle off the land and that get their crops off the land, that they're going to build the wind turbine farm or build a solar farm, and that they need to move on this project and convert from an option agreement into a long-term lease agreement. And this would all have been pre-agreed at the very outset when the option agreement was being signed. So I always say to farmers, it's very important to seek good advice from a good solicitor and an accountant before entering these long-term agreements, and be informed of tax and legal considerations, because there are tax considerations there for the next generation when the land is being transferred to them, because the land is not primarily being used for agricultural purposes. So there may be reliefs like agricultural relief that needs to be, you need to make sure that you won't lose your agricultural relief on the transfer of that asset to the next generation. So 2023 was a very significant year for solar PV for smaller systems, so like less than 50 kilowatts. I'm talking about micro generation, mini generation, those areas. We had the elimination of the planning requirements for rooftop solar. And that was a big step forward, because it meant that if people wanted to develop PV panels onto their house, onto their farm buildings, they didn't need to seek planning unless they were within 5 kilometers of what's called a solar safeguard zone. And there'd be areas beside airports where there'd be a risk of glare for airplanes coming in and landing. But it's a very small proportion of the country that is affected by solar safeguard zones, and even with that, there's still allowed 300 square meters of solar PV, so it's not very restrictive. We had revisions to the VAT regulations. There's no VAT on the panels. There's 60% grant through the Tams, which is the Target Agriculture Modernisation Scheme, and that's available, that 60% grant, to both the farm and the farmhouse. The payback is generally 2 to 4 years for solar PV systems on Irish farms at the moment, so it's quite good. And there's the option for selling back excess electricity back to the grid. So in terms of the Solar Capital Investment Scheme, this is part of Tams 3. Every eligible farmer can avail of a 60% grant for the solar PV system. That includes the inverters, the panels, the controllers, the cabling, the isolation switches, all the vital components of a solar PV system. What's interesting this time around compared to Tams 2 is that it falls under a standalone investment ceiling of €90,000 without affecting ability to avail of other Tams measures. What I really mean there is that if, for example, a farmer wanted to do a slatted shed or do a straw bedded shed, do a tank for storing effluent, or build a silage slab, all those areas are covered under Tams as well. In the previous Tams, if you hit your limit of €80,000 was actually in the previous Tams. As you hit your limit, that meant you had nothing left in the pot to purchase solar panels. But this time around, the solar panels have been put into a separate pot of money, a standalone silo of money, specifically for solar PV panels. So it doesn't affect your spending in other areas. You can still get on with doing your tanks, doing your sheds, doing your silage slabs, your tanks. It won't affect that pot of money. The solar panel costs vary depending on the type, the quality, and the size of the system as well. So, how big you decide to get. Are you going to go for 4 kilowatts, a 5 kilowatt, or a 30 kilowatt system, or maybe a pig or poultry unit might be going for maybe a 100 kilowatt system. So it'll all depend on, what your energy use is, and that'll determine the cost of it as well. The department have developed what's called reference costs. So they have a fair idea of what these panels cost and what it shouldn't exceed in terms of the price, which it should not exceed. If you go above the reference cost, the department reference cost, you have to pay the difference, which is not eligible for grant aid. So you can't exceed the department reference cost. I find that most people are able to stay within the department's reference costs quite comfortably, so it doesn't seem to be an issue. The department is also, there's various tranches of the solar capital investment scheme. So one tranche closes, a new tranche opens, and they generally stay open for about a 3-month period, and then they close it off again, and then a new tranche opens. And it takes the department about 3 months to give approvals after a tranche is closed to people who are successful with their applications. Going back to those reference costs there, the department's reference costs are 1,441 per kilowatt installed, plus an installation cost of 1,849. So if you take an example there, a 10 kilowatt peak output system would work out at 1,441 by 10 plus the 1,849 is 16,259 is what that system would typically cost. That includes the inverters, the cabling, the switching systems, everything like that. But of that figure, that's up to the max of the reference cost. So some people might come in a bit lower than that, that they may be able to get it in at a lower price, but they'll get 60% of the lower price if that's the case. If their costs come in higher than the 16,259, they have to pay the difference themselves. It won't be covered by the Department of Agriculture. So in that situation, of the 16,259, 60% of that is 9,917. So you could say that the vast majority is just over €6,000 of a net cost is what the farmer will have to bear in that situation. So solar PV rechargeable batteries are also eligible for grant aid for up to 50% of the panel peak output. So in this example that I have put here, I had a 10 kilowatt peak system. So 50% of that would be a 5 kilowatt hour, not kilowatt, but kilowatt hour. So a 5 kilowatt hour battery would be eligible in this situation. So the reference cost for the batteries are €703 per kilowatt hour. So we took a 5 kilowatt hour battery system at those reference costs of €703 per kilowatt hour, plus an installation cost of €753. That would mean that the battery reference cost would work out at €4,268. So the farmer is eligible for 60% of this, which is 2,560. So the difference then, the other 40% would have to be paid by the farmer. That's the net cost. So it's quite a good grant, and that's the reason why there's a considerable level of interest in this within farming circles at the moment. Many people thought that it wasn't possible to export electricity to the grid when you were getting a Tams grant, but the Department of Agriculture can't stop you from exporting electricity, and inevitably at certain times of the day on a dairy farm, you will be generating electricity. When the cows are out on grass in a midsummer's day, and say in May, June, July, you're only really using maybe in the middle of the day some electricity, excuse me, some electricity to generate cooling for your milk cooling, and that will be it. So you're generating a lot of electricity, and it has to go back to the grid. You can heat a certain amount of hot water using a diverter. That can be one way of using the electricity and storing it. Excuse me. But um, the department can't stop you from exporting to the grid. Where they can restrict you is in the size of the system, and that'll be based on the farm's previous electricity usage. So they look at your ESB bills or your electricity bills or your utility bills for the previous 12 months, and they take the kilowatt hours over the previous 12 months and divide that by 1,000, and that determines the size of the system that you can get. So take an example there. If a farmer used 20,000 kilowatt hours in the previous 12 months, and that's shown on the bills, you take the 20,000 divided by 1,000, that's a 20 kilowatt system is what they'd be entitled to apply for. They may discover that they can't or shouldn't go as high as 20 kilowatts because they're limited by the transformer capacity potentially in their area. So they will probably go in some situations with a smaller system than they're actually entitled to go for from a Tams perspective. So what they get paid for, the producer of the renewable electricity has the right to export the surplus electricity. They get paid what's called the Clean Export Guarantee, or the CEG. This is what your utility is going to offer you. So if you're with Electric Ireland, if you're with Energia, if you're with Pinergy, if you're with Border&West, they all have different rates that they will offer. I always say it's important to make sure that, that when you do sign up like that you're not going to be fleeced on, that you might be getting a good price in terms of a market rate of maybe 24 cent per kilowatt hour, but you may discover that you're paying a very high peak rate for electricity at times of the day when you actually need it, and that you might be better off having a lower rate, market rate, and then having a lower rate as well for the peak electricity times of the day as well. So it's just something that needs to be watched out for. So this is a deal between the producer and the supplier of the electricity. So if you have to deal with whoever supplies the electricity to you. So if you're buying your electricity from Electric Ireland, you'll be selling it back to them. That may change in the future where you can actually sell it back to different providers, but that's the way things currently stand. So we're stuck with that at the moment. In terms of grid connection, I suppose this allows you to export electricity back to the grid at times when you're not able to use it yourself. So in terms of microgeneration connection, you can go up to 6 kilowatts for single phase electricity consumption, or up to 11 kilowatts for three-phase electricity consumption. This is at microgeneration level. Every domestic house will be in microgenerators. They will be at this level, microgeneration. And this is what's called a simple inform and fit process, and they use this form called an NC6. So there is no cost in doing this. There's no connection fees, but you do have to inform your electricity provider that you're a microgenerator and you are producing electricity at your site, and that they need to know about that. And it's after you've done that, then you're in a position to sell the electricity back to your electricity provider. In terms of then, what came in 2023 was the mini generation connection option. And it allows you to go up to 17 kilowatts for single phase electricity connection, or up to 50 kilowatts for three-phase electricity connection. There is a cost associated with this. It's almost €1,000, and you have to fill out a form called an NC7 form in order to make this application. Essentially, what you're doing here is you're paying ESB networks to come out and do a technical assessment of your area, of your buildings, and what's to see what the transformer capacity is. That's probably the most important thing in your local area, and that will determine how big your system can get. So you may potentially have a situation where a farmer has maybe he's on single phase. He wants to put in maybe a 24 kilowatt system, but he may discover that he can only get maybe 10 kilowatts back to his transformer, kVA transformer. So he may just discover he has very, very limited export capacity, because your maximum import capacity determines your maximum export capacity. And he may discover that the capacity is not there for a large system. So there could be certain times of the day when you can't get that electricity back on those warm summer's days, and there's no point in oversizing the system, to a 24 kilowatt system if you can only get 10 back at times of the day when potentially you are producing 24 kilowatts of electricity every hour and you can only get 10 back every hour, maybe lower than 10. You may discover the figure is lower. Some people have been disappointed when they discover that they had low export capacity. So this is after you send in your NC7, that's when the ESB networks will do their technical assessment. They will say to you, do you want to come up to a certain capacity, or do you want us to tell you how big you can get based on the existing connection and existing transformer capacity in your area? Most people say, tell me how big I can get, because for smaller systems, it generally doesn't make economic sense to be putting in poles and pylons and bigger transformers in an area for small micro generation or mini generation systems. It wouldn't be worthwhile. But if we can start getting a bit bigger than this, for larger systems, where fields are being covered, that's where you get the economies of scale and justification for upgrading the grid in a local area. So that's where people will start paying money to upgrade the grid. I've already talked to you about the large scale generation where large tracts of land are covered by solar panels or wind turbines. I've talked to you about the mini generation under Tams and to the solar capital investment scheme. But the government is at the moment in the process of developing a support mechanism that comes in between those two schemes that are currently there. So that between 50 kilowatts and I suppose 500 kilowatts anyways, there's no support mechanism there at all. There's no scheme there to support, small turbines, small scale electricity generation between 50 kilowatts and 500 kilowatts. So that the government is developing what's called the small scale generation scheme, or the SSG, or some call it SRES, small scale renewable electricity support scheme. So this will enable farmers, businesses, communities to develop medium to large commercial renewable electricity projects between 50 kilowatts and 6 megawatts. I put in 6 megawatts there because communities can get up to 6 megawatts are expected. We don't have the terms and conditions of it yet, but the expectation is that communities will get a 6 megawatt, can go up to 6 megawatts. So whether that's solar panels that's owned by a community, whether it's a wind turbine that's owned by a community, or a biogas plant that's owned by a community, these are the type of projects that could be relevant here. So the details are expected to be released soon. We had been hoping to hear about it earlier on this year, but we still have heard nothing about it. The biggest challenge is the ability for farmers to secure appropriate grid connections for the export of the electricity. So maybe in some of these cases, if it's a big enough system, it might warrant or justify bringing poles, wires, maybe a substation to an area to justify building a larger scale system. So you may have some farmers that might build a 1 megawatt system. They might have a business on their farm as well that justifies this, that they can make themselves more energy secure and export any excess electricity back onto the grid. The scheme is likely to be funded by the Public Service Obligation, the PSO. So that's a fund that everyone essentially pays for it on their electricity bills, and that's funding the deployment of renewables onto our grid and making this transition to renewable technologies more seamless. So the government believes that this scheme could deliver 800 megawatts of renewable electricity, the equivalent of 4,000 acres of solar panels by 2030. So the technologies that are expected to be included here are onshore wind. Projects which are designed exclusively for exporting electricity must be over 1 megawatt in output. You might have onshore wind projects, you might have solar PV, rooftop and ground mounted, hybrid wind and solar projects. So, high efficiency combined heat and power, biomass fueled high efficiency combined heat and power, or biogas, which would be from the anaerobic digestion area, high efficiency combined heat and power. So there's heat and electricity being produced together. The current wholesale price of electricity is high, and I suppose the idea is that if the price of renewable electricity fell below a certain level, that's where a feed-in premium or a floating feed-in premium would kick in. So that's going to deliver a guaranteed return on the investment for the investors. So if the market rate of electricity fell below a certain level, you'd always be guaranteed that the government will bring it up to a certain level that would guarantee a return on the investment of 6%. So it's an interesting scheme. We're waiting on the details of it, but just to make you aware of it, and there could be certain times when the price of electricity goes above a certain level or goes very high, that farmers may have to pay back to the electricity customers during times of high wholesale prices. So you could be caught the other way too. So, but I suppose it does guarantee the investors a return on the investment. There is a community fund built in from the Res 3. And that will remain in place. So I think community is going to move into the small scale, to the SRES, the small scale renewable electricity support scheme. Yeah, I just wanted to make you aware of, I suppose, this technology. Many farmers are being approached at the moment. This area of anaerobic digestion it's a biological process. You're breaking down organic material in the absence of oxygen. You're converting that organic material into biogas and into digestate. And the process begins when organic waste materials such as animal manure, food waste, or crop residues are fed into a sealed digester tank. This is your primary digester here. And inside the tank, you get naturally occurring microorganisms, and they decompose the organic material through a series of stages. So it's hydrolysis and it's acidogenesis. And there's different bacteria working at different times within the digestion process. So, excuse me. So the final stage of it is when the when the methanogenic bacteria, they're converting the substances into biogas. And biogas is primarily composed of methane and carbon dioxide. And the biogas produced, that can be harnessed, as a renewable energy source for generating electricity, for heat, or it can be used as a vehicle fuel as well. So what's interesting about this technology is the fact that it can be used for heat, transport, and electricity. It's not an intermittent technology like solar or wind. It can produce electricity and heat all year round, every day. So it's quite interesting from that perspective as well. And I suppose through the process of AD as well, you can take, what's called digestate. So 90% of what goes into the digester has to come out the other end as digestate. So it's a rich form of compost. It can be used as an agricultural fertilizer. It is very, very valuable nutrients that can be returned to the soil. And through the process of AD, you're producing manure, organic manures, but you're also contributing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions because you're degassing slurries. You're taking out the methane out of the slurry, and you're also producing renewable energy from it. It is also possible to upgrade that biogas, take out the carbon dioxide from the biogas, take out the hydrogen sulfide, and you're left with compressed biomethane. And that biomethane can be used for injected into our national gas grid. And that can be seamlessly done, injected into the gas grid to produce a gas, the equivalent of propane gas that's in the grid at the moment. So it'll be over 97% methane, and that's called biomethane. So it's a renewable form of gas. And essentially it will need farmers producing grass silage, whole crop wheat, it could be maize silage, but it'll be mainly grass silage coming from farms, along with cattle slurry, pig slurry, poultry manure, feeding into these digesters to produce this renewable gas, which will be needed by 2030. The government has a target of 5.7 terawatt hours of biomethane gas by 2030, and that will lead to the construction of between 200 to 250 biogas plants right across the country. They'll be of varying sizes. There might be 20 gigawatt hour plants, there might be 40 gigawatt hour plants, or somewhere in between. So the policy instrument that we're looking at to drive all of this is called the RHO, or the Renewable Heat Obligation. We don't have it at the moment. It's not there in situ, but that policy mechanism will be needed to make all of this a reality. So industry experts believe that it falls short of providing the necessary confidence and certainty needed by investors in this whole area, but we have to wait and see, because it's quite a high cost to build these biogas plants. I don't see farmers building these plants themselves. I see the investment coming from pension funds, but maybe farmers may have a role in supplying the grass, the slurry into these digesters, because these plants could cost in the region of 20 million, maybe 30 million to build a biomethane plant. They're quite a high investment cost. But they will be dotted around the country, maybe providing renewable gas into Sligo town, maybe into other areas that currently aren't on the gas grid. So there may be options for all of this to come in the future, and that, I suppose, guarantees maybe more foreign direct investment when people have access to renewable gas in their area. And what that 5.7 terawatt hours means, it's about replacing 10% of the current natural gas that we use in Ireland at the moment. So you're replacing a natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, with the renewable gas, which is biomethane. And I suppose the question is, how much further could we go above the 10%? Because we need in the region of around 120,000 hectares of land to meet that target of 5.7 terawatt hours. So it'll be a combination of grass silage, it'll be slurry, it'll be maybe other crops, but there'll be a lot of winter slurry from animals, because we don't have a continuous supply of slurry. Animals are only housed in Ireland for maybe 20 weeks in the year at most in some areas. And so it's that winter slurry from 1.3 million cattle, or 20% of the winter slurry, will have to be mobilised to go into these digesters. You're also talking about pig slurry, poultry manure as well, going into these digesters. So it's a diversification of grassland and a diversification opportunity for farmers to supply, maybe to displace livestock on their land. And biomethane must reduce emissions by 70% compared to natural gas. I give the example there earlier on of a 20 gigawatt hour plant to maybe a 40 gigawatt hour plant. This is an example here of the tonnage of material that you need for a 28 gigawatt hour plant. That's in megawatt hours there, but if you take off the three zeros at the end, it's a 28 gigawatt hour plant. And that would need, if you were using 35,000 tons of grass silage and 5,000 tons of animal slurry, that's 40,000 tons of material going into this digester every year, quite considerable. The reality is you'd need more of this animal slurry and a smaller proportion of the grass silage to meet the emissions reduction that's going to be required by 2026 compared to natural gas. So I suppose the main point of this table is it is possible to work out how many cubic meters of biogas you'll get from a ton of grass silage, what percentage of methane will be in that, and how many megawatt hours that you get from those from that tonnage, and then you can work out how many acres of land that you'd need to supply those megawatt hours as well. So I mentioned the RHO, or the Renewable Heat Obligation. That's going to place an obligation on the heat sector, so the likes of GNI, Gas Networks Ireland. It's incentivizing them to use renewable fuel. So essentially, a bit like a PSO in the heat sector. You will see to pay for this renewable heat, because the cost of biomethane is 4 times that of natural gas at the moment. So it's quite a divergence in price. So who pays for that divergence in price of a 4 times difference in price? So it's the RHO is the expected mechanism to pay for it at this higher cost of producing biomethane. If I was speaking to you directly after the invasion of Ukraine, when wholesale electricity prices and gas prices went through the roof, there was very little subsidization needed at that stage, because the wholesale price was so high. But when prices have settled back now to lower levels, this is where subsidization is needed. In the long run, short term, medium term, you need it to make this a viable project, and investors won't get behind it unless they know there's government commitment to all of this. So the SSRH offers ongoing. The SSRH is the other policy mechanism that was launched in June of 2019, and it was recently relaunched for the emissions trading sector. So the SSRH, the support scheme for renewable heat, it offers ongoing tariffs for 15 years for using heat from biomass or biogas, as well as a 40% grant on air, water, and ground source heat pumps. So there's many hotels, hospitals, nursing homes right across the country are putting in biomass boilers running on wood chip or wood pellets, and they're getting the SSRH funding mechanism for doing that. And Tams 3 also provides grant aid for biomass boilers and heat pumps. And this gives you an idea about the payment rate. So it's not like the cash for ash scandal in Northern Ireland, where the more you burnt, the more you got paid. In this SSRH tariff, the more you burn, the less you get paid. So people between 0 and 300 megawatt hours get paid €56.60 per megawatt hour. And then as you drop down to tier 2, between 300 megawatt hours and 1000 megawatt hours, you drop down to €30.20 per megawatt hour. So as you can see, then you're down to €5 per megawatt hour between 1,000 and 10,000 megawatt hours. And there are also rates there for the heat from anaerobic digestion. Nobody is really biting at this area at all. I'm not aware of anyone building digesters, small-scale digesters, that are being subsidised by this heat element of the SSRH. But it's hotels, hospitals, nursing homes, swimming pools. They're the people that are really investing in the biomass boilers, and they're getting a fairly good payback on their investment. That's just a poultry example there, a poultry unit example there. If they put in a 400 kilowatt boiler, they're using 1,700 megawatt hours per year. So they'll be in tiers 1, 2, and 3 of the SSRH tariffs. If they're displacing oil, and you work out how much the oil is costing, this is just for example purposes. If the oil was costing 66 cents, I mean the oil was costing €105,000 per year. But the wood chip, if that's costing €58,000 per year, that's a saving already without any SSRH of 47, almost €48,000. But if you add the SSRH extra income, which is at those 3 tiers of 1, 2, and 3, there's 300 megawatts at €56.60, which is 16,980, plus tier 2 and 3. It brings an SSRH payment, which is available for 15 years, by the way, of €41,620. So that's a total saving between wood chip, the lower cost of wood chip versus oil, and the SSRH payment brings a saving of almost €90,000 per year, so giving a payback in about 2.9 years. I always say anything under 5 years is a good payback, plus you will be getting this for another 15 years. So it does make sense for those large businesses that have a large heat and hot water demand. Poultry units, pig units are putting them in, as are hotels, hospitals, nursing homes. So finally, Paul, the opportunities for the development of renewables on farms is great. There's plenty of roof space. Dairy farms that operate spring calving systems produce most of their milk during the summer, so that's where solar PV makes a lot of sense for them to be looking at that particular technology. Don't forget about the audits as well. They provide valuable information in terms of where you're using your energy and where the savings can be made. So electricity prices have fluctuated continuously in recent years, so it does give some kind of certainty in terms over the coming years when you do have these technologies generating a certain amount of your own electricity. So Ireland will see an increased shift towards farm use and supply of renewable energy. You've seen that with grass for biomethane plants. You've seen it with wind turbines, solar PV farms. So farmers will have whether it's forestry, pulpwood from forestry, for the biomass industry, these farmers will have a major role to play in this energy transition. So I'll leave it at that, Paul, and take any questions.
That's great, Barry. Thanks for that. It was a very thorough overview. You really got through a lot of stuff there, and I think it shows your expertise in the topics. Anyways, I had a few questions, but you covered them all, to be completely honest. The one that comes up a lot for us is around what is the Tams, the solar for Tams based on. So it's, as you mentioned, it's your bills for the last 12 months before that.
That's right, yeah.
You
And
know,
that's an important part of it, Paul, is an energy survey has to be done. And that's what the department looks to see, how much electricity you used over the previous 12 months. So that's a key component of it. So everyone would have to, I'd be saying to anybody who's thinking of this, dig out your bills for the previous 12 months, look at the kilowatt hours of electricity that you've used, divide that figure by 1,000, and that's what the department will allow you to go to in terms of the size of the system. But as I mentioned already too, you may discover that you won't even be able to get that high because the transformer capacity mightn't be adequate. And Mel there beside us knows all about that too.
And so, is there anybody that has attended that would like to ask any questions? Feel free to raise your hand, or if you unmute and just go for it. Anybody want to go first? Or was it all covered incredibly well and we don't need to have any questions?